So, a couple weeks ago at work, I was trying not to work, as you do, and I was looking up cemeteries in South Carolina that I might want to go check out for my next cemetery exploration video. And I kept finding these ones that said they were under Lake Moultrie or under Lake Marion, and there were so many. I counted over 20 of them that were now under Lake Moultrie or Lake Marion, and I wondered how this happened, and so I found out, and now I'm going to tell you about it, why there are thousands of people buried now under Lake Moultrie and Lake Marion. I'd like to first acknowledge my sources for this information. I got a lot from Wikipedia, of course, and then also a woman named Kelsey Moore who wrote two articles, at least that I've found, for two separate websites that I will link below, and all the other websites I found with information and photos about this process of these cemeteries ending up under the lakes. And I will, all of those links to all of those websites will be in the description box below the video. So in 1938, the South Carolina Public Service Authority began work on the Santi Cooper hydroelectric and navigation project in Berkeley County and parts of neighboring Orangeburg County. This area was once a prosperous plantation region, and now, feeling the impact of the Great Depression, its residents were suffering from extreme poverty. State and federal officials saw the Santi Cooper project as a solution to the area's many problems. The project itself had three main goals. One, to extend electricity to rural communities, two, to trigger economic growth, and three, to improve the public health of the area with electricity and running water and all that good stuff that most of us have now. As part of New Deal initiatives, the Santi Cooper project received funding from the Public Works Administration project, giving hope that the South, a region that President at the time, Franklin D. Roosevelt, had called the nation's #1 economic program. Problem, not project. Problem, as in, I have a problem saying words. Could be redeveloped. But to complete this project, 9,000 graves, well, nearly 9,000 is the information I found, nearly 9,000 graves would have to be removed or be flooded over. Most of these graves, oh, I know you'll be shocked. Sit down for this. You won't believe it. Most of these graves were those of enslaved Africans and their descendants. So between 1938 and 1940, the authority hired investigators to determine the condition and ultimately the fate of each of these cemeteries. Charles Taylor was the director of the cemetery division for this authority, and he called dealing with the remains a sacred task, but there were many differences in how white, black, and indigenous burial grounds were treated. I'm sure you saw that coming. So the investigators, why can't I say that word today? Investigators, they went out and interviewed the residents of these rural communities. They asked for the names of the deceased and the names of the deceased living relatives so they could presumably go speak to all of them. One of the people interviewed was a woman named Dolly Small, and Kelsey Moore tells her story in her writing on the fate of Goshen Plantation Cemetery. In 1938, Dolly Small, a widowed black woman in her mid-50s, lived on Barrow Hill Road with her three grandchildren, Beulah, Jr., and Ava. Though surrounded by family and a community, Small had experienced tremendous loss. She had not only lost her husband, but she had also lost at least two children. Just 27 years prior, Small buried her then 6-year-old son, Frank, in Goshen Plantation Cemetery. There, his headstone, one of two markers out of more than 100 graves in the cemetery, served as a memorial site for his grieving mother. However, by December 1938, Goshen Plantation Cemetery would no longer be viewed as a site of memory, but as an impediment to infrastructural development. The entire Barrow Hill community, a black community near the old Harbin and Goshen plantations in Berkeley County, would end up submerged under Lake Moultrie. Kelsey Moore continues, regardless of the extensive communal information residents like Small provided, investigators described most black cemeteries such as Goshen as no fence, badly neglected, overgrown, overgrown with grass and bush. The rigid description of the cemetery imprinted an image of the burial grounds and their accountable communities as disregarded and uninterested. By creating rigid surveys and photographing cemeteries, the authority created knowledge about black cemeteries. As investigators repeatedly condemned the perceived condition of black cemeteries in the basin, photographs of black graveyards were meant to confirm their description as fact visually. Littering the archive with such depictions, the authority entered a long history of obscuring black presence and knowledges while justifying the certain future black basin residents faced in 1938, a future of submersion. While surveying cemeteries like Goshen, white cemetery investigators failed to recognize the racialized mortuary practices in the basin. Park or garden-like cemeteries with obsessively manicured vegetation and meticulously calculated rows were the standard for the white investigators. However, the aesthetics of black cemeteries looked different. Graves of enslaved people and their descendants were often mounded and marked with materials not discernible to non-community members. For example, the cemetery report of Bethlehem Graveyard, which would be removed, noted that a tin can marked one person's grave. Often, black mourners decorated graves with dishes, shells, pipes, lamps, and clocks. Sometimes, the last used item of the departed was placed on the grave. Furthermore, black mortuary beliefs decentered the need to control the surrounding natural environment. Thus, it would not be uncommon to see cemeteries surrounded by heavily forested areas. Goshen Plantation Cemetery was not an exception, but the rule. The cemetery division ended up determining that at least 3,000 black graves would be left undisturbed, which means they would be flooded under the two reservoirs, Lake Marion and Lake Moultrie, created by damming the Santi and Cooper rivers. Most of the Santi Cooper Basin was covered with swamps, and naturally the surrounding plantations were built on this swampy land. Enslaved Africans would flee to the swamps to escape their enslavers, and many indigenous communities lived in the swamps. In the last days of the Civil War, enslaved people used the swamps to fight Confederate troops. Along with serving as sites of marinage, swamps provided a natural landscape for enslaved Africans and their descendants to carry out spiritual practices. With its trees, brackish waters, and low-lying plains, swamps naturally embodied Congo cosmologies. In these traditions, water and forests served as portals for the living to access the dead. In fact, many enslaved people in the basin chose sites near swamps to bury their deceased loved ones. So after the public authorities felt they had done enough interviewing and investigating, they distributed public notices via local newspapers, reading as follows. All right, listen, this is really hard for me to read for some reason, but I'm going to do my best. The relatives of all persons buried within the area above described are hereby required, in pursuance of the requirements of the statutes of South Carolina, to furnish to said South Carolina Public Service Authority at its office in the People's Building, Charleston, South Carolina, on or before March 12, 1941, a statement in writing of their wishes with respect to the disposition of the remains of such persons so buried, which statement shall be signed by the person making the request and shall give his post office address, failing in which the authority will be at liberty to proceed in pursuance to the provisions of the statutes made and provided in such cases. I don't know if it's the lack of periods or what, but that was just really hard for me to read. But yeah, so basically, hey, read this notice and let us know before this certain time, or we're gonna do whatever we want with the remains of your loved ones. You're probably already thinking of a couple problems with this. First of all, not only would the residents addressed in this notice need to purchase the newspaper that it was published in, they would also need to be literate, able to read the notice and be able to write their response. Also, they would have to have land to move their they would have to have land to move their ancestors to, because the the authority did not set aside land for them to use for reburial. They would already have to have a place to move their dead loved ones. Since legally, this notice was all the authorities needed to do before proceeding with flooding the land, directors of the engineering and cemetery departments decided that all cemeteries below elevation 67 would be flooded, creating the Panopolis Reservoir. These cemeteries included Goshen Plantation Cemetery and at least 30 more black cemeteries containing over 3,000 graves. To picture that visually, here's an image of some cemeteries that are under Lake Moultrie and Lake Marion. The website I will link below has an interactive map so you can see the details of each cemetery listed. Dates of burials and family names interred there are provided where the information was available. Ultimately, 5,000 graves of enslaved Africans and their descendants would be removed at the request of white landowners. These were reinterred on land either provided by landowners or purchased by the South Carolina Public Service Authority. Now, I know a couple paragraphs ago I said that they did not provide land to move people to. The websites where I'm getting this information, I didn't read anything in the interim where they said, okay, we'll give a little bit of land. I don't know the details on that one, but some were able to be moved to land that the authority provided. I'm not sure. Those might be like very small areas where they became like part of the national forest. I'm talking out my ass, though. I'm not sure how that worked. I still have some research to do on that part. But there were still people left that were not, their graves were not moved, as well as indigenous burial grounds where they might not have even known where they all were located, but they did know that indigenous peoples lived in that area throughout history. The disruption of graves violated long-standing mortuary beliefs held by black South Carolinians in the Santi Cooper Basin. Many descendants of enslaved Africans in South Carolina carried traditions from the Congo. Graves acted as a meeting place between the living and the dead. Many black South Carolinians believed that cemeteries needed to exist in forests and swamps to hinder access by those who were not related to the deceased. Outside of Berkeley County, investigators were not as thorough. There were cemeteries in Calhoun, Clarendon, and Lee counties that were not investigated at all before the creation of Lake Moultrie and Lake Marion. So I believe it is safe to say we don't know how many more cemeteries would be under the lake at this time. I mean, we could find out. But at this moment, when I'm speaking about this, I couldn't tell you how many more cemeteries would be under the lake from ones that they did not even look into or attempt to notify people that they were going to be flooded. And like I said, the basin was known to be home to several indigenous groups like the Etowah, the Coosa, the Edisto, and Cape Fear peoples. Probably pronounced a couple of those wrong. Sorry, I'm bad at pronouncing words I've been saying my whole life. So, like I said, the basin was home to several indigenous groups, and many indigenous mounds, burial mounds, were found on old plantations, and most of them were submerged in the creation of the lakes. Kelsey Moore concludes in her essay, still, the map fails to account for all black cemeteries that existed in the area. Plantations, either defunct, burned down, or abandoned well before the 20th century, likely held cemeteries for enslaved peoples. By the 20th century, black residents migrated elsewhere and passed away, making living memories of those cemeteries disappear. In addition, many black residents stopped burying their loved ones in plantation cemeteries, preferring to use church or private family burial plots. The Simpson-Harvey tract, number 14 on that interactive map, shows an example of this phenomena. This growing shift from the plantation cemetery to the church graveyard highlighted the expansion of institutionalization of black religions after Reconstruction. The memory of what was there before seemed intentionally left out of the local history. On the beach, which there is no sign of a commemorative plaque detailing who and what existed in the area before the lakes were engineered. After speaking with residents over the past year and a half, some Black locals knew of the darker history of the lakes. Others were surprised to learn that thousands of graves lay underneath. Perhaps the layers of sedimented violences experienced by those buried underneath the lake are too much to resurface. A commemorative plaque could not even address the harm done to Black residents in the basin area. Maybe that would add another layer of silences. In some places in the United States of America, some concerned groups and politicians are fighting to keep some things out of school curriculum. Things that might make kids feel bad about actions of the past, especially having to do with Black history. A lot of terrible things have happened in the past. A lot of terrible things happen now and will continue to happen in the future. While you may find it too depressing to dwell on these subjects, being educated about them and understanding why they happened and the repercussions that will echo through subsequent generations is extremely important. Those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it is a quote attributed to many people. But it's not just knowing the history. It's imperative to work to make sure terrible things in history are not repeated by anyone. Pay attention to the words and the actions of people in power. Pay attention to those who follow those people in power. In this age of AI and misinformation all over the place, you have to become a bit of an investigator yourself. You have to find the truth and don't be swayed by false information, no matter who it comes from. Even if it's someone you admire or respect, like a teacher at school, it could be a sports person, it could be you can tell I don't know much about sports. It could be a celebrity or a preacher. Take that information, but don't let yourself be emotionally manipulated. Check multiple sources and find the receipts. A very small, exaggerated news snippet that you get can roll down the hill and become bigger and bigger until it turns into a catastrophe. Always ask yourself, who does this benefit? Who does this harm? What are the motives behind this information? My dad used to tell me, he's still alive, he just hasn't said this in a while, but when I was growing up, he would tell me, believe none of what you hear and half of what you see. And that's even more true today. Over 100,000 people a year visit the areas of Lake Moultrie and Lake Marion to fish, swim, jet ski, and do all the other summer activities that people enjoy doing on a body of water. If you visit the lakes, please give a moment to think about the incredibly important history deep below them. Tell other people about it so they know too. And tell me if you have a man-made lake nearby that might be hiding dark secrets. Thanks for watching.